I think a couple people have prepared some slides, so maybe this would be a good chance to allow one of them to give a discussion. I know Ben's got something, I know Nico has something, and I know Chris Mongol has something. So maybe Ben wants to go first, but maybe we wait a minute for a couple more people to find their way. We went from like 34 to 29, so. Yeah, why don't you just go ahead, Ben?
All right. Everybody can see this, right?
Yep.
All right. So
wait, Ben, we're now looking at your kind of presenter view, I think.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. How about now?
Better. Good.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll be talking about a few points related to how to identify concepts for knowledge assembly. I'm Ben Yuri, and I work at the Lab of Systems Pharmacology at Harvard Medical School. And Charlie is actually part of my group here. And you can see our group's website and my personal website in the bottom there. So for several years now, we've been working on systems that can automatically assemble knowledge from multiple sources, including from structured sources like pathway databases, from the literature using text mining and expert input. And here we mostly mean causal mechanistic knowledge. And so all these sources are pooled into a common knowledge representation upon which we can operate and do things like correct common errors, resolve redundancies, assess believability and relevance, infer missing information, and create a kind of coherent knowledge base from which we can again automatically generate executable models or mechanistic networks that one can connect with actual data and produce explanations or predictions. And the basic underlying software that we have developed is called Indra that implements this conceptual workflow. And so Indra collects and assembles causal mechanistic relations involving a lot of different types of entities. So we have to be able to identify genes, proteins, and RNAs, families and complexes of proteins, protein fragments and chains, various kinds of small molecules, and higher level concepts like biological processes, diseases, phenotypes, as well as contextual details like tissues, cell types, cell lines, cellular locations, and so on. And so all this is the underlying infrastructure for frameworks such as the EMMA framework, where a fully automated and autonomous cycle of knowledge aggregation and modeling is going on, and disease-specific models are kept up to date effectively in the cloud fully autonomously. So all this code has to operate without any errors and any inconsistencies in a fully autonomous way. So it's really important to get the absolute identification of all these types of concepts exactly right. And so if you look at some of the sources of Indra, we have dozens of text mining systems that Indra is integrated with, as well as structured sources. So some of the structured sources are things like Pathway Commons or the CTD database. And those are the sources of causal statements. And in addition, we have wrappers and clients towards several other resources where we get not necessarily causal statements, but naming information, mapping information, ontological relationship information, and so on. And so here's a snowflake, because each of these sources is like a special snowflake. So they all have their own way of identifying namespaces and prefixes and identifiers. And if we want to build a system that can produce something coherent from all these sources, then we need to standardize across all these. And so here's just one example from one of the modules of Indra. This happens to be for one of the text mining systems that Indra is integrated with. And you can see a very small snippet of the Python code and some comments on the right-hand side about how things are identified in this source. So you see, for instance, that from this source, we get cabby IDs without the embedded namespace, which is supposed to be the standard. We have references to next prod families that for some reason use the prefix FA. These actually cannot be resolved with identifiers.org. There's no entry for next prod families. We are getting interpro IDs with the IPR prefix, which is non-standard. For some reason, the PFEM IDs use the XFEM prefix, again, non-standard. Go IDs sometimes come with and sometimes come without the embedded namespace. We have to handle that. PubChem IDs are using the PCID namespace because somebody implementing that system decided to choose that. And so this is just one out of the many, many modules that were listed on the previous slide. And so basically what we need is a definition of namespaces to use within Indra and formalized patterns that we can validate against to make sure that everything that flows into this central assembly workflow is valid and coherent. So a note on URIs, it doesn't seem to be a particularly good solution for us in this case because URIs themselves are not standard. As Charlie also had a slide about this, you can have a reference pointing to the same thing using an HTTP versus HTTPS. Identifiers.org, for instance, has old versus new style patterns, and some sources might use one or the other, so we have to handle both. The namespace embedded versus not embedded issue also results in some variability in how these URLs are constructed. Some sources actually allow you, like HGNC, their pattern definition for identifiers allows you to either have a prefix in the identifier or not have it. So effectively, you end up having to handle both, and you can see that in the code on the left-hand side. And then the code just keeps going on and on to handle more and more special cases. So URIs aren't really a simplification or in whatever we're doing when collecting knowledge from these sources. So I think from the perspective of Indra and the other systems we're working on, what we need is a central registry of namespaces and identifier patterns, a meta registry that connects these, because we do want to be able to generate links to identifiers.org or OLS, and so we need a way to convert and map between those. We need a resolver that when we generate, for instance, interactive websites and networks, that there's a URL that you can click through to get to a provider's website. And then I think what, in my experience working on this for many years, the most important thing is to have this registry or resource be extensible and modifiable rapidly and in a decentralized fashion. So I can figure out what the issue is, I can figure out what's missing, and I want to be able to basically contribute directly to a resource with the appropriate reviews and all that, but still. And I think that automated tests and workflows can really decrease the prevalence of clerical errors that can cause all sorts of issues in these automated systems. So if the content of this registry is automatically tested, that's a big plus. And ideally, all this has to be available in various different forms, as a programmatic web service, a website that you can go to as a human, a software package for adding as a direct dependency or local usage, and the underlying resource files need to be downloadable and used directly. So that's sort of our use case.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to ask that maybe we let a couple people make their presentations, because it might actually be the case that they overlap in some of the ideas before we open it up for questions. So Chris, do you want to go next? Are you prepared?
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
All right, I put about 6 slides together here, where I'm sort of like representing kind of common problems that I have seen across multiple different projects that I'm involved with. So I thought I'd be cheeky and try and kind of like cram actual 2 fairly sort of like distinct use cases in here. One is kind of like just a very kind of like simple common use case, which is, you know, kind of what Benjamin talked about as well, which is just being able to join and merge data across databases. And then I'll touch on this kind of like INSDC model that we have with the registries at the moment, which I think is a nice exemplar of some general issues with governance. But first, you know, what many of us, you know, need to do in many projects is just to take data from different data sets and kind of like merge it together somehow, do joins and merges, and integrate data and make it useful. And you know, as we've kind of like known how to do this for like 51 years. Like this was like in June 1970, Cod came up with his relational database model paper, where he came up with a kind of like a formalism for being able to do kind of like projections and joins and merges across databases. So you have kind of primary keys and foreign keys. And if the primary key kind of like matches, you can kind of like join these together. If the primary key points to the foreign key, then you can do a join between these tables. So this has all been like, you know, works out for like over, you know, half a century now. But yet we seem to have like just completely messed this up in the bioinformatics community anyway, such that, you know, all of us, you know, that code that Benjamin showed, we've, you know, I'm sure many of us here have written code like that, you know, again and again. You know, I don't know how many kind of like, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in total have been spent like just doing this kind of like dumb normalization that we do all of the time. So we've all seen this where, you know, every single kind of like, you know, permeable pattern there is to write an identifier, we've come up with it. So really at the end of the day, oh, and you know, for a while, you know, many of us thought, okay, this is great. This is what the semantic web is for. This is what like, you know, linked data can kind of like save us here, because, you know, instead of these kind of ambiguous ways to write IDs, we would have like a kind of common system of URIs to be able to write things. But of course, you know, we've there are many, you know, different ways to write kind of URIs for one particular entity. This is something I think we have solved within OBO, because for any one ontology concept, there is a single URI and OBO library URI to resolve these things. But for things that are not in OBO, you know, there are multiple different ways to write this. And I'm not talking about alternative URLs here. I mean, I think the bioportal example from earlier on was maybe a bit of a red herring, because no one intended that URL to be serve as an actual identifier. But these are all URLs that, you know, people have used as actual linked data identifiers for the same entity. And of course, I'm not even talking about mapping between, you know, ensemble and NCBI gene here. This is just ways to represent an NCBI gene identifier. So really, you know, what, you know, many of us want from the bioregistry is just, it's really, really simple. We just want a single canonical way to write global, you know, identifiers / CURIEs, such that we can, you know, join and merge data together without writing all this kind of awful normalization code all the time. So, you know, this includes kind of like case sensitivity, includes like not doing this kind of like crazy doubling up of IDs. So, you know, the one way to write the, you know, a Go identifier as a CURIE is, you know, this way with the uppercase GO here. Then, you know, a more, you know, maybe a slightly more kind of like complex one that we did with the kind of like the prefix mapping, prefix commons biocontext project, is to kind of come up with not just the standard prefixes, but the standard way to enroll that prefix to a single URI as well. And I think this is much harder to agree on in a global sense. So the approach we took with biocontext was, you know, you could have multiple different context maps, you know, so you could have an OBO context map where GEO would map to, you know, the OBO library GEO, which is an ontology of geological concepts. And then there may be a different kind of like context that would use GEO to map to the NCBI database there. So I think this is something that we can also achieve within Bioregistry as well. And then another thing I wanted to touch on, which seems quite specific to a small set of prefixes, but I think, you know, these are really important identifiers here, and I think this nicely kind of like exemplifies some issues with kind of like, you know, governance and who gets to kind of like register kind of like prefixes and who kind of owns them and so on. So we've got this kind of confusion with how INSDC identifiers are handled right now in all of these registries. And just to kind of explain INSDC, so who people aren't familiar with it, this is the International Sequencing Database Consortium. So this includes NCBI, EBI, DDBJ, and what happens here is kind of maybe quite unusual and is not typical of many other identifiers. But there's these three databases share essentially the same data when it comes to a subset of data types, such as studies, samples, experiments, runs, assemblies, and so on. So that you will have maybe an INSDC identifier for a biosample, but that identifier can be looked up in any of these three databases. But what happens right now is if you go to Bioregistry and you look at the biosample record, and this I think came from identifiers.org originally, you see something that is, first of all, if you read the text description, it's a little bit kind of like confusing until you realize that this is implicitly talking about the EBI instance of biosample rather than the kind of the INSDC biosample entry. And if you actually use this to resolve an identifier, then it will kind of show you this list. It includes the EBI, but it doesn't include DDBJ or NCBI. And if you kind of like click on the default resolver, it will take you to the EBI page. Yeah, in some ways, scientifically, this isn't a big deal. You get the same information if you go to NCBI, but politically, this can kind of cause problems because people, don't want to be seen to be favoring one or the other, and this can cause issues if you have kind of funding from one government or another. So I think we need to have some kind of like solution here as well, and this kind of touches on other things that I think we need to really have common design patterns for, such things like having the dot nomenclature in these prefixes. I think this is a good place to use these. So we can imagine having anything that is an INSDC as having this kind of like dot nomenclature. And then when we essentially treat all the three different databases as equal and give users the choice as to which ones these resolve to. And most importantly, we should kind of coordinate this with INSDC themselves. So, in some ways, this is kind of quite, in the weeds and specific, but I think it does kind of like nicely exemplify, an issue where maybe not all identifiers are treated in exactly the same way, and also kind of exemplifies issues with who owns the bioregistry entry. Like, because the EBI biosample people, I guess, register biosample, do they kind of own that, or do we have a kind of a mechanism of saying, okay, biosample is actually more generic than the EBI instance, and we should kind of like genericize that. So I think that's all I had there. So I guess we'll do questions at the very end.
Yeah. So I think Nico also prepared something. And by the way, if anybody else had something prepared, I'm not aware of it. So just let me know after Nico's done. Nico, you still here?
Yep,
Great.
sorry. Yeah, my internet connection is very bad. I'm on an island right now, so I leave my video off. So most of the things that are relevant to this particular use case, it's very now specific compared to the things that were presented before. Were already touched upon. So I would just mention these are way more, let's say, simple problems, but probably the solutions to these will be very much more complicated in the end than it seems that right now. But what we are doing, so we have a project, it doesn't matter what it is now, it's about sharing mapping metadata. And one of the issues that we have to deal with is constantly moving between two formats, one which is based on semantic web technologies, like using IRIs, URIs for as resource identifiers, and having CURIEs on the other side. This is so for us, the main use case for the first main use case is actually having these kind of an ability to build these kind of translation tables. So if I get faced with a URI, with the OBOYUR based IRI, we have like a simple kind of rule of how we can convert this to a query. But if you have some other kind of IRI, you may not be able to build a query from that without having some sort of query map or prefix map associated that you can use. And so we are actually looking for something like a standardized translation table. And for me, generally, one of the issues that we have been faced with is that exactly this first slide that Chris showed is that CURIEs have been used, the Curie syntax, even across OBO ontologies, namely in these like ominous 1 million dB cross references that we have. They have been even used there, and no one now knows what exactly these things refer to anymore. So when I say no one, of course, it's a bit of an exaggeration. You can kind of guess if it's HP : that it must be human phenotype ontology, but
Nico, just you're sharing a kind of like a GitHub screen that is
yeah,
kind of like,
sorry,
is that intentional? Okay.
No, yeah, yeah, I wanted to basically just show.
Okay.
So I was still introducing the issue itself. So yeah, so basically what we have is the situation that in our raw data that we are using to translate, we have lots of URLs, lots of IRIs, and we need to translate between the two. And what Charlie and Bioregistry is able to compose for us is a kind of context that is specific for me, for myself, where I can have prefixes in an order of registries that I want. Basically, I can say something like, I want to prefer OBO prefixes above everything else. And then I say next, I would prefer some other prefix registry. And also if I find prefixes like that I want to, where I want to override the default of one of the other registries, I can also request that, and that would get changed as well. So that's the translation use case. So again, for us, that's the simple thing. We need to go back and forth. So we actually need a kind of a translation table to go from one to the other. The other thing that I want to really mention is that so for us, sustainability is a really important thing, of course, and it was mentioned before. That is the kind of critical thing that big organizations like NIH do, of course, need a sustainable infrastructure for these kinds of operations like lookups and stuff. But for me, what is really, really important is a public collaborative workflow system for these kinds of things. So if I want to be able to see my context somewhere checked in a GitHub repository, I want to be able to go there, make my own pull requests, and not rely on some obscure workflow that deals with these things. So I want to feel like I have a bit more control, and even if no one else will do the work, that I can basically interact and build these preferred prefixes and edit them by myself. So something more community near and community close is really important for these things, because we have a lot of turnaround. We need to change prefixes and preferred IDs very quickly. Yeah, so that's kind of it. So this is the basic use case we do here, and yeah, that's all I wanted to share.
Thank you, Nico. So does anybody else have anything that they had prepared ahead of time? Otherwise, we can open it up for questions for either Ben, Nico, Chris, or just to have discussion. We've got about 15 minutes before the planned break, so I think this is a good place to be. Yeah, Tom Gillespie, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. There was one thing that was mentioned in, I think, the first presentation, which was the idea that there's like sort of 4 things that you want for each one of these. You want a Python package, you want the resolver, you want, a couple of other things. And one thing that I think most of us have also dealt with is the fact that there are so many of these systems that if you have to go find a Python package for every one of them, your maintenance burden on your software is enormous. And for users outside of this ecosystem, it discourages them from doing the efficient and right thing, which is to do this computationally and not do it as a one-off. So trying to centralize some of the tooling within the Bioregistry's ecosystem at large, so that we can, in an outward-facing way, say, use this library. It is maintained by the community. It has all of the quirks dealt with And if somebody, right, if like if a resolver is retired, we can replace it with another one. That's one approach that I think might, you know, it would be a point where we as a community could centralize some effort.
Thanks,
Yeah, I
Tom.
agree.
That's really nice. James has his hand raised. Would you like to say something?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for organizing this workshop. And I don't know, respectfully, I think I want to play devil's advocate a bit. So Chris was talking about the general problem of like joining data. And that's definitely a problem that I have. I do day to day. But it feels to me like linked data does, the tool stack does solve the problem. And as long as we use it carefully and correctly, then these problems are figured out. And so when you want to merge data, like, so RDF is specifically designed to merge data across the web where you don't necessarily know where the data is coming from or where it's going. And it doesn't use CURIEs, uses URIs or IRIs. And the idea is to use the same IRI for the same thing. And then you can end up using like string identity to match these things. You shouldn't be comparing CURIEs to see if you have the same thing. You should be expanding your CURIEs using the context that you define for your local system, and then comparing those to see how they match up. So I don't know, in the chat, someone mentioned the red herrings. I guess I'm a bit confused about identifiers.org. I don't quite understand. But in general, the way we do it in OBO is we have like one IRI for each ontology concept, and that's like stable, and we keep it fixed all the time. And you don't need a Python library to figure it out. Use HTTP to follow the URI and get it redirected to like a browser that happens to be working for it. And if we change browsers, then we change the Perl system to redirect it. And the Perl system is all on GitHub and it's all open and just uses HTTP and redirects. It's about as simple and stupid as it can be. It just seems, so there is a genuine problem, I think, if resources want to share their data, but they don't, they do need to set like consistent URIs and they need to maintain them. That's just one of the bits of discipline that we need for making these systems work. But it seems to be we have all the tools. We just need to use the tools properly and correctly. And I mean, there is, if we do want to settle on a set of CURIEs within a context for biology or something, maybe we can do that. We're never going to get a universal system of prefixes. I mean, that's what URLs do. They have this cool way of combining domain name system where people can register their global domain name with local part for the identifiers, so that we have like a practically unlimited set of identifiers that people can define for themselves and then resolve globally. I mean, that does what it needs to do. And yeah, we should rely on the URI, IRI system for comparing the names of things. We shouldn't, I don't think we should be expecting, I don't know. We can't get a set of global prefixes. That's just not an option. Maybe within biology, we can agree on something and maybe that's convenient, but yeah, that's my point. I think we have all the tools. If we use them carefully, then I think they should do the job. And often they do the job already.
Thanks, James. I think that's a really good, yeah, I think saying devil's advocates is nice, but it's a different perspective and it's a good solution to the problem that we're all thinking about. So it's worth everybody considering that. But Chris maybe has something to say about this.
I think it is the perfect solution, but the challenge here is how this works great for OBO, because if you're making an ontology, you're immediately kind of born into the linked data ecosystem and you're kind of forced to use URIs as identifiers. How do we get the system to work with, if you've got resources? I don't know if we've got anyone from NCBI here, but maybe I'm going to assume that they don't particularly care so much about semantic web technology. How do we get them to kind of like bless the one canonical URI that should be used for example, NCBI gene identifiers? I mean, I know one thing we shouldn't do is just ask them, what are your URLs? Because they give us URLs that are for humans to use for like websites, and these will kind of like change, so they don't function well as kind of like some actual identifiers. So I I'm really in favor of this, but I don't know how, how as a community we can best kind of like, get kind of blessed URIs from all of these different resources that we care about that are not immediately born into the linked data ecosystem.
As one quick example, Chris, for NCBI taxon, so there's OBO defined our pearls for it, and BioPortal has different ones. That's kind of bad, but well, that is bad. But then recently they, at the top of their pages, they started suggesting like a certain consistent identifier. I don't think it actually resolves, but they started to suggest a consistent way of doing it. I guess I'd rather use that example because I understand it better than the gene one, but I don't know, just throwing it out there as an example that we can talk about. I do take the general point.
Chris, your hand is still up. Do you have something else you want to say?
Oh, no, sorry.
Okay, so Tom Gillespie wrote in the chat, how do we deal with maintained resources and organizations that have different priorities, but that we have to interoperate with? I think that we've all had this issue before. So yeah, anybody have any ideas on that? This is a really big ongoing question. Krishna mentions you can't really force anybody to adopt something. And I say the easy answer is, yeah, you can't force anybody to do anything necessarily. While everyone's pondering that, maybe I can call on Tim Clark, because he had his hand raised at the end of Ben's talk and he never got a chance to mention his point. Sorry, if you already had it answered, then that's fine.
No, I actually didn't have my hand raised. Maybe I was scratching my head or something.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Tom, go ahead.
So sort of related to this is that I think I wanted to really strongly agree with what James said about the fact that right, we have the DNS system. It gives us the IRIs. Trying to recreate another DNS system to disambiguate prefixes is a big challenge that we probably don't want to take on. And if we embed the prefixes or the expansion rules for CURIEs and prefixes in our documents, and we encourage people to do that, then we don't have to deal with these problems. I think the big question that I have is which one of these is harder, right? Each of us can spin up our own prefix, right, expanding service if we wanted to. I mean, everybody's done it at some point on this call, I'm fairly certain. The question is, right, do we try to do something like go to the publishers and say, hey, if you're publishing a life sciences paper and people are using these prefixes, please embed the expansion rule that they are using for this. Right, we had reasonable success going to editors and publishers and getting stuff like that done in other contexts. So maybe that's another approach that we could take here.
Don't you think that, let's assume that you have two people wanting to make available things with PubChem IDs, right? And they might use a different URL prefix. And you won't be able to say in an absolute sense that this is like a PubChem identifier just based on the URL prefix expansion, especially given that they can use different kind of standards, different capitalization, for instance, anything like that, right? So to me, it seems more logical to have some kind of a registry where you can absolutely identify some of these resources. And yeah.
Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, now I do have my hand up. I just want to suggest that, that we think about this. I want to just suggest that we think about this in terms of another issue, which is very closely related, which is persistent IDs, right? So you can't sort of defer all this onto the DNS, because domain names can expire because they might not be funded, right? So I think what you really want to also look at the issue of where do I find, where can I go to get redirect information that's consistent with what FAIR data requires. We wrote a paper about this a year before FAIR came out, and these kinds of issues, like you could go and get the schema.org metadata and tell you where to go, where your authoritative endpoint or endpoints are.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's also another concern. It's kind of interesting that we have a lot of different things that are touching the same place, and there's different sets of concerns for each person. So I'm writing this all down in the Google Doc. Anybody else can feel free to also take notes as we're going, as we're realizing that there are so many different dimensions to the problems that we're all trying to solve.
I'll just add something, if I could. Does anybody remember when the Perl system collapsed temporarily?
It sucked.
Yeah, I wanted to, there's a great example of this that I can't find, but Paul Walk gave a talk on the Dublin core URIs and the Perl system and exactly this. And he said, you know, we think that the URIs are persistent, and we said, okay, so we're going to put it in Perl, but it turned out that the Dublin core website itself was much more persistent than the Perl system in terms of its behavior and resolution. So they've switched everything over to use that. But that means that we're delegating persistence to the organizational structure, which is just kicking the can down the road.
I suppose we trust people to run their websites though, right?
Didn't Facebook go down the other day, and WhatsApp as well?
Yeah, but that didn't mean their URIs as identifiers failed. It means they didn't resolve. You can still do comparisons to see if you're referring to the same thing. But it's true that all these systems are big systems, they can fail. But why do you think that your system built on top of these things isn't going to fail? Like prefix, whatever, Bioregistry uses the DNS system. Bioregistry has hosts and servers too.
So I'll just add this, just along the FAIR data thread. One of the requirements is that the metadata for an object needs to persist even if the actual object contents are not available anymore, right? So that if you do have a registry that is, you know, persistence means also organizational persistence, funding persistence, and so forth, or sufficient delegation and distribution that you don't have that problem. So, you know, at least the metadata, which the redirect is a piece of metadata, and there's others that are important that enable you to look it up if you don't start with the correct identifier to be able to find the identifier, right? So I think that's an important thread in this conversation.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing there's nothing magic about persistent identifiers, right? They always, there's content is always held somewhere locally, and it's distributed all over the internet. So we will always have reliance on like an individual publisher. Like the DOI relies on individual publisher archives being present and continuing to be present. And by the way, the DOI system went out for 3 days when the CNRI forgot to renew their domain name. That was a couple of years back. So everybody is liable to these things. We just have to figure out how to, you know, shore them up properly. And
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm going to call on Ian, and then once he's done, we're going to break for about 10 minutes, and we're going to try our best to keep on the schedule and keep everybody's time very valuable. So Ian, go ahead, and then we'll make a break.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise, you know, other use cases outside the linked data world. And one of the things, you know, particularly in relation to FAIR, is we're encouraging, requiring NIH has published its new data sharing policy, requiring submission of data by ordinary scientists. And their use case, I mean, they're going to be producing tab delimited files, CSVs, whatever, in which we want them to be using globally unique identifiers. And I think the requirement for them to be using long URIs is, I'm not sure that that's a practical proposition for your average lab scientist to be working with, encyclopedic length strings in their spreadsheets.
That's a really good point. We all have our own interests in this group, and all of us are very knowledgeable, but ultimately we do want other scientists to also get on board. And so we need to pick solutions that they will be able to handle and that everyone can kind of use.
This needs broad rollouts to a wide user base.
So thanks, Ian. I think that's a really good place to leave this discussion for now. We're going to take about 10 minutes break. Why don't we say we come back at, well, I'm on Europe time, so I'm going to say at 19:30, which on West Coast time is 10:30. Yeah. Quick math. So yeah, let's meet again here in about 12 minutes. Everybody take a bio break, and then we'll do the next section of the session, which will be a little bit of discussion about the bioregistry. So thanks everyone. See you in a bit. I guess I'll hang out in case anybody has some questions on the chat.
I think some people may have joined the old Zoom room. I'm just looking at some Slacks in different places. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm looking at the Slack for a different meeting.
Okay. All right. So we're at 23. Looks like everybody who cut out at the end of the last session, maybe they'll filter back in. So it'll take like 2 more minutes. Otherwise, we'll get going and talk about the bioregistry. Okay, we're at 2 minutes past the time to come back. So I think we're ready to get going. So in this next session, I'm going to give a little bit of a walkthrough to the bioregistry. There's no slides that go with this. I'm actually going to present the website and I'm going to present the code, and I'm going to embark on the perilous journey of giving a live code demo. So wish me luck. Things always go wrong when you give demos. So, you know, let's see what happens. In the Slack, sorry, not Slack chat, in the chat, I've recently posted links to the, no, I haven't, sorry about that. I'm going to post links so everyone can follow along. The first website we're going to go to is the Bioregistry website. So by the way, I'm not usually using Safari, but we're going to try our best. I hope everyone can see what the text is well enough. Yeah, so the bioregistry is a potential solution to a lot of the things that we've been discussing today. It's open source. We're looking at the website right now, but we're going to check out the code and the data itself in a bit. It's able to be curated by the community by being open source because anybody can look at the content itself. It's stored in a JSON file on GitHub. Anybody can make a pull request to it that wants to. You know, but the bioregistry also functions as a meta registry. This idea that I mentioned way back in the beginning, it's mapping between all of the different registries that we talked about in the different aspects of our conversations between the OBO Foundry, identifiers.org, OLS, keeping in mind to remember that they all have sort of different purposes and there's different kinds of metadata associated with each of those registries, but at least we can map the same things that are in each of them. The bioregistry also acts as kind of a resolver, the same way identifiers.org and name to thing do. It's quite easy to implement a resolver once you've got the ability to generate a prefix map and once you're in a web scenario. So it made a lot of sense to kind of build that in. And also the sort of wisdom gained over generating the bioregistry and doing the curation of all of the parts of it kind of made it a little bit easier to make a resolver that's more permissive. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So it's making all that noise. It's Tiffany. Done. Okay, so yeah, I want to just give a little bit more background on kind of like when we were building the bioregistry, what do we have in mind? So we've got the summary slide. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to that. So what else? Yeah, the other thing about the bioregistry is that it's bringing in all of the information from external registries kind of on a nightly basis in an automated fashion. And it's doing its best to automatically align all of them together. And when it's not able to do that, it asks for a little bit of help in curation. And it does this every night. It makes some TSVs that it pushes to GitHub and it says, please go and curate this stuff so we can have higher quality content. Yeah, and then all around that is this Python package that allows us to build tests and to write automated testing procedures, also using the same kind of daily build to make sure that we haven't broken the integrity of our data or that we're not missing anything that we need. Like, for example, there's a test that ensures every entry in the bioregistry has a name, a home page, a description, an example identifier, and so on. So things that the bioregistry isn't, it's not a lookup service. Like it doesn't solve the same problem that the OLS or ABROWL or BioPortal do. And it's not a content host. So, it's very lightweight. The whole of the bioregistry is only a couple megabytes. And in fact, it even runs with like a very limited amount of memory and few requirements as a web service. And then the Python package the same. So like to kind of go back a little bit, the original motivation that I had for building the bioregistry was when I was trying to extract all the cross-references from ontologies in the OBO Foundry. And I ran into the issue that there are a lot of different kinds of synonyms that people were using in CURIEs, and there are a lot of different kind of funny formalisms that were popping up. And so I started building tools to normalize these things. And I realized that I was curating all of this stuff, and it could be kind of stored as configuration files rather than hard coding it into my Python code. And I thought about how I could sort of generalize this. And then I realized I needed to pull in information from other places. And then when I was pulling that information in, sometimes I needed to be able to override it because it was out of date or it was wrong or there was a better solution. So anyway, the bioregistry eventually started to encompass all sorts of other registries. And is that possible, like with all these mappings between them, to explain, what's the overlap between the bioregistry's content and other registries, and like how much does it cover? And so there's a couple of resources that the bioregistry completely imports, like the OBO Foundry, the ontology lookup service, identifiers.org. And then there's a couple of resources that it imports part of, but not all, like the gene ontologies registry and the bioportal and the biolink registry. And so it's getting all of these different sources, and some of them aren't possible to import all of because the things that the registry covers aren't actually the sort of entries that you'd want in a registry that's called in the metadata that I mentioned at the top of the workshop. So yeah, the question that some people might have is like, how complete is the bioregistry? Does it have all of the prefixes? The answer is kind of no, but that's hard to really answer because it's a very dynamic thing. We can always add new prefixes to describe new resources that people might be using the local unique identifiers in other resources. So it's also possible to like add new stuff. And so there's some programmatic ways to import new registries and to build up this kind of automated daily import. So yeah, the web, I'll go back and just give you a little bit of a walkthrough in the website. So the first thing is you can directly like use this search system. So you can say I've got a Kibi identifier. Well, my computer doesn't like Kibi apparently. And when you put in a bad thing, it says, okay, you didn't match the regular expression properly. And when you did, you can like follow that URL and it does what you'd expect. More interestingly is what happens when you just want to look at Kibi page. So every entry in the bioregistry, all the prefixes, they all have some extra information associated with them. They have like the prefix, some of them have a preferred prefix, like what Chris Mungo was talking about earlier. So we can sort of agree that this is the canonical one that we want everyone to use. The other prefix is kind of like this normalized, string normalized one. So we don't have to worry about any cases or punctuation. And then it also has this list of alternative prefixes that you kind of need to start curating these if you want to extract all of the different CURIEs out of something like the OBO Foundry. And then, it should have information about like the homepage, and because it's connected to the OBO Foundry, there's ability to download like the OBO file and the OWL file going with this as an ontology. When there's contact information available, like Adnan Malik is responsible for Kibi right now. There is sort of like this pattern for local unique identifiers. So a lot of these are not hand curated. Some of them are imported from other resources. And so this is actually a contentious thing I'd like to discuss later, is how these regular expression patterns look. Because in my opinion, I don't think there should be this Kibi colon part right there. The local identifier inside Kibi is like just this number. But anyway, we do need to support people who might accidentally write stuff this way, or maybe even on purpose. And so that's where this namespace in pattern thing comes. And luckily identifiers.org is like annotating this for some. And inside the bioregistry, we've sort of required that everywhere that there's a true for this namespace and pattern, you should also curate the banana. So here's the banana in practice. That's actually what a banana looks like. It's the Kibi. So the banana is the part that might appear in the beginning that you're not really sure if it should be there or not. And so you can normalize it by putting it in or taking it out, depending on your context. And then here's one of those examples. And so let's scroll down just a little bit. We also have the meta registry. And so this links everything that Kibi is linked to from the bioregistry. You can either construct a URL or you can sort of point to the entry in another registry. So for example, Bioportal is another registry, and Bioportal actually has a page for Kiwi itself. So this this page actually links to Kiwi's entry in the Bioportal. We can follow that, and we'll see exactly what you'd expect. That was taking a bit to load. So here's the Kiwi page in Bioportal. The same thing is true for a couple other ones, but for example, Cellosaurus has its own registry. Cellosaurus's registry does not have the ability to resolve prefixes and show information about prefixes themselves, so it's not going to build a link for that. Now, Kiwi is a really conserved resource, so it's got a lot of entries around here. Let's scroll down a little bit to talk about providers. And so this is what's really at the back of any resolver or any prefix map, is the ability to take a given query that's using this prefix and a local identifier. We're going to use this 24867 as the example. And it's able to construct all sorts of different URIs that go with this. So the first one is obviously like the first party one. So if we follow that, that's fine. Bioregistry also is able to like resolve these things. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the demo, you can sort of use the same interface that you'd use in identifiers.org. So there's a bioregistry link. Here's what the identifiers.org link looks like. And so internally, the bioregistry is able to construct all of these. And so these first couple were pretty simple, but when we start getting to the more complicated ones, like the ontology lookup service, which actually has an OBO Perl inside its definition. So it actually has to be able to construct an OBO Foundry Perl and then put that in. And then there's Bioportal. This one also is using OBO Perls in some instances. So there's also some extra providers that kind of go along with Kiwi. So there's this one right here, which allows you to generate an image for this. Yeah, so these can all just get, let's see if this works. Yes, OLS can query for the query. And I think also Bioportal has the ability to do that. Chris wrote in the chat, can we add a canonical pronunciation metadata tag? I love Kiwi, but say Kebi. Yeah, sorry about that. I think I'm wrong, but I can't change my ways at this point. Okay, so that's kind of what happens when you're looking at a page for a entry in Bioregistry. You can also like download all these things either as JSON, YAML, or like RDF in a couple different formats. So like, let's look at that for a second. Yeah, so this has all the information about Kiwi. Kiwi. Kui. Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading things from the chat. All right, so let's look at what happens when we kind of want to look at one of these other meta registries. So, okay, sorry, the meta registry, when we want to look at information on the registry. So let's look at the gene ontology registry. This actually, oh, this isn't the link that I was expecting, sorry. So we have the registry that has all the different prefixes within the bioregistry. And so you can basically just download this whole list and all of the metadata that goes with here. I guess that button isn't working for some reason. Yeah, so this is the place where you can kind of look at all of these entries. And now I'm using Safari, and it's appearing to me that this is not using the data frame properly. So hold on, let me switch on over to a different version of the same website. All right, here we go. So now we can search. We can say like I want Kiwi and find Kiwi. Okay, here's Kiro, which is also related to Kiwi. Some of the other ones also mention it. Just a simple text search. Yeah, so you can download like the whole database as JSON or YAML or one of these other formats. Here's the link. Like if you want to add something and make a change, just follow this link to suggest an improvement. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And then here's the link to the actual database itself. So again, I'll come back to that in a couple minutes. Let's talk about the meta registry a little bit. This is the place where we list all the information about other registries in the bioregistry. And these things, these entries all have metadata about each of them. And also within the code base, there's information on how you can construct URIs that go with them for entities or also for the prefixes themselves. So let's look at, okay, yeah, so here's the meta registry entry for the bioregistry and the bioregistry, because yo dog, I heard you like registries. Let's look at the identifiers.org entry. So identifiers.org has a homepage. You can like actually download the whole data set from identifiers.org. It's got a link to that. It has some capabilities that it's listing. It's got a contact information. This is for Henning. It's got an example meta identifier. I'm not sure if people really like the idea of this. Maybe I should just say prefix. So like Kiwi is a prefix within identifiers.org. And so identifiers.org being a registry is actually a resource itself. So it can like resolve information about KEBI, which is one of its entries inside it. And then also is able to like resolve queries. So here's an example of that query being resolved. Let's see, what else can we talk about here real quick? What's on my list? Web demo, prefix workflow. All right, I'm now going to bring you guys to the GitHub page and just give you a little walkthrough there. So I hope everyone can see this all right. It's nighttime in Germany already, so we're in dark mode for the moment, but I hope this is fine. So the Bioregistry is completely based on this package right here. It's a Python package. Inside it is some JSON data, and I hope all of it's pretty accessible. Now, you don't necessarily have to spend all of your time looking at the GitHub page. You can also use the documentation on the Python package, which is a link to here. And you can also spend your time working through the website. So this is only for people who want it. However, if you want to make some edits to the Bioregistry, what you do is you navigate to the site, you go into the data folder, and you look at the bioregistry.json file. Now, it's not going to make the whole JSON file pop up now because it's a little big. So maybe I'll come back in a couple minutes and show you that PyCharm. But not everybody's comfortable editing files on GitHub. And so this is a problem, right? We want to make sure that anybody can make improvements to the Bioregistry, especially making requests for new prefixes. This is maybe the most important one. So we actually built a workflow to do that. And so you can make a new request for a prefix in the Bioregistry by going to the issues tracker, going to the new issue button, and then selecting this template, request new prefix, and then following what it says to do. So I'm actually going to try and live demo this for you and see what happens. So you get to this page, and first of all, you need to kind of give it a title. So we're going to use grass space as the example. I think what I want to do before we start this demo is do this. So we're going to add a prefix for grass space. Grass space is it's a nomenclature about grass species, which also includes corn, I found out. So first thing we have to do is we have to pick a prefix to go for our new resource. And so most resources either use like an acronym or just kind of a lowercase version of their resource name. So we'll just type grass space in lowercase. And the same thing, we'll type in the name of grass space one more time. This is also a place where we shouldn't be using acronyms because we want this to be as accessible for everybody as possible. And then we can put in the homepage for grass space, which, yeah, I've already pre-prepared all this stuff like a cooking show. Yeah, and then we can also type in the description of grass space. So the nice thing about this, this interface, by the way, is GitHub actually allows you to auto-generate these forms now. So this is a required field. And some of their fields, we really do want people to write and write well, and some fields aren't required. So having like the prefix, the name, the homepage, a description, I'm going to copy paste in a description. I'm going to fix that typo. Yeah, so then we also want example local unique identifier. So I'm going to use the example of corn, which I found the other day, and the local identifier for corn is IMP 10873. So yeah, the next thing is to add in a regular expression pattern for a local unique identifier. I know that's a mouthful, but this is a really useful tool to have for validating our CURIEs or our identifiers or whatever resources are built with these. And so we ask when people make a curation if they know something about this to tell us. But this is a little bit tricky. Not everybody knows how to write regular expression syntax, so this is optional. And you know, there'll always be the chance to give a review before this is done. Luckily, I know what the regular expression pattern is for grass space. It starts with an IMP or a GEN, and then it has 5 numbers after it. And then in the beginning, there's this hat, and at the end, there's this $ to let you know that's the beginning and end of the regular expression. There's this information if there's a banana related to this, which there's not. Most people aren't going to have to use this. And then there's this URI format string. So like I mentioned earlier, people are usually thinking about URI prefixes, but the Bioregistry is using the more general notion of the URI format string. Luckily for grass space, the URI format string is well behaved, and it also means that we can make a URI prefix to do all the semantic web stuff we'd want to do later. And then the last bit is you should write your contributor name and your ORCID ID, because we want to make sure people get credit for all the nice stuff that they attach to this database. And after that, you press submit new issue, and hopefully magic happens. Now, I'm not going to press the button now because I actually already did this demo a little bit ago. And so what happens is it creates a pull request based on the issue that you created. And I'm going to just, sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit. So here's what happens. I press the new issue button, and it kind of fills in an issue, basically using the template and putting some information. And in the background, the bioregistry is running every time an issue is created, and it's checking if the issue has these labels for a prefix, and then it's trying to parse up the issue and find all the information about the new resource, and then it makes a pull request where it makes that edit in the bioregistry. And so, yeah, I mean, this is all what we just saw. And then it creates this pull request. So here we go. Here's the pull request. GitHub Actions does it, but it is committed on behalf of the author. So not only are you going to get credit based on your ORCID ID in the database itself, but you also get credit on GitHub using the commit history. And this is meaningful to different people. So I think it's good that we got this right. So here's what happens like when you actually make this edit, it's changed some files. And so here's what it looks like to add an entry to the bioregistry. In the end, the bioregistry is a dictionary. And the keys in the dictionary are the prefix, and inside the value is another dictionary that has all of the metadata that you've put in. So here we go. Here's the contributor. The name of the contributor is me, the ORCID ID, the description we've written, the example, the homepage, the name, the pattern, and I don't like this name, but this is the URL. So this is like the URI prefix, the URI format string. So yeah, basically we're like one step away from this being part of the bioregistry. The only thing that has to happen next is someone has to review this pull request. And so that's going to bring me into the next part of the discussion about the bioregistry, which is something Melissa Handel brought up earlier that is severely lacking in a lot of other resources, is the idea of governance. And this is sort of the model that we want to have for governance in the bioregistry. Is we want anybody to be able to give these reviews, but also we do want to train people a little bit. We want to have kind of a responsible team. So I'm going to go to the issues, and I'm going to bring up policy issues. And so here's our basic proposal for bioregistry governance. I'm going to walk you through this kind of quickly. This is there for anybody to look at and comment on, and let us know if you think that's good. Hold on, there's something in the chat. Let's see.
Just praise for you, don't worry.
Oh, good, thank you. I'm always worried when people are making messages that they're like asking about stuff I forgot. Okay, so here's our idea for governance of the bioregistry. First of all, there's kind of two bits to working with the bioregistry in my mind. First, there's the idea of editing the data in the database itself. And then there's also the idea of editing the code that surrounds it. And I think these are responsibilities that some people are interested in both, like me particularly, and some people may only want to engage in one of them, but not the other. So let's talk about like the ideas we have for governance. So when it comes to updating the bioregistry, I think what we need to do is give some guidelines on like how people should review the edits. We've already provided the infrastructure for making a form, what's required and what's not. And so a lot of the ideas about making reviews are sort of automated before the submission's even made. In the OBO Foundry, for example, there's a lot of back and forth that happens after somebody makes a submission because there isn't really any code or any tools that sort of tell people what's right and what's wrong before they make a submission. And yeah, in the bioregistry, it's possible to automatically give feedback using these, first of all, the form, which has required fields, and then the continuous integration that runs on every change to the database to make sure that the data all has good quality. So yeah, the manual updates to this should all be done like through an issue or a pull request. And then there's also this set of continuous integration tests that are going to run every time you make a change. And so this is the way of literally codifying the requirements for adding new or changing things in the bioregistry. And then, you know, when it comes to making changes, they should all be done as pull requests. So a team of reviewers can look at them and use their best judgment because we can't make rules for everything. So it's a best practice that a person who's on the review team shouldn't approve their own updates. Yeah, so these policies, like they'll go into effect when we sort of come up with a critical mass. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by a review team in a second. We have this idea that, you know, prefixes should conform to a certain set of standards, and we're sort of enumerating them and talking about these at the same time. And then people should be able to, you know, get attribution. They should get credit for doing requests. They should be given credit for doing reviews, for making issues. All of this sort of stuff is really meaningful. In fact, there's even tools like the Apicuron database, which are tracking this stuff now. You might be able to integrate that directly. So the idea of a review team would be people who are responsible for looking at requests to change the database itself, like new prefixes, merging prefixes, splitting them up, updating metadata associated. In fact, GitHub even has a technical solution for creating a team that's able to do certain things. And so, okay, let's see what else I've written here. Yeah, in the meantime, we have to bootstrap a little bit of this governance. So anyway, we'll be interested to like ask people if they want to be part of a review team. So in the beginning, people should like say, hey, I want to join, I want to be part of this community and help. And then, we can give a little bit of training, and then people will have the ability to actually review pull requests and accept them and then merge them together. And so, we have a couple ideas on how we can build up this membership of a potential review team, and then how like adding people and maybe removing people if they've been inactive or if they should leave should work. So these things seem a little bit overkill for kind of a new project that's very fit to purpose. But I think one of the things we've learned is that if you don't think about this ahead of time, it gets to the point where you need this kind of governance, and it's not there to help solve a problem that you're not really sure how to solve diplomatically anymore. Okay, so on the other side, there's sort of the idea of people who might want to work on the code base that surrounds the bioregistry. And it's basically the same idea, is those people should be able to maintain the repository. They should be able to make some contributions. The difference being is we actually kind of would like people to just go ahead and make code contributions anyway, the same way with pull requests. And they don't necessarily need to have, yeah, okay, Ben's raising his hand. So I think he's probably got a good point to interject. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, not necessarily an interjection directly to this point, but that the licensing is actually on the data is constructed in a way that we make the data available under a CC0 license, which is basically the most permissive possible data license, meaning that you can basically take it and do whatever you want with it. And the code is also licensed under a BSD license, right, Charlie?
I think it's MIT, but
MIT,
they're both very permissive.
Which is probably one of the most permissive code licenses for allows commercial usage and all that kind of stuff. And so this hopefully ensures that these are sustainable. So there's a group of people who originally created this are out of the picture. There's no funding. These can still be totally freely used and continued.
Yeah, that's something that we've really carefully considered. Like I may have built a lot of the code that runs this, but at some point I may not be working on it anymore. There should be a way to gracefully hand it off to a group. And that's why we want to sort of offload responsibility or diffuse it into a team of people who we'd like to invite people who are interested to get involved. And we can provide mentorship and training in the beginning, and then hopefully that makes it more sustainable. There were a couple questions in the chat, which I'll answer very quickly. One of them, can you do bulk requests and bulk imports? Yes, because it's a JSON file and you could just edit it. And in fact, there's already sort of some programmatic infrastructure for doing that kind of thing. Is syncing automated? Yes, it runs every night on a GitHub action. And how are clashes handled? That's a little bit more complicated. And I only have a couple more minutes for the demo right now. But basically what happens is if it finds a clash, it's going to ask you to do a curation on it. And one good example of that was with the geographical entity ontology, which clashed with the gene expression omnibus. And it said, hey, these things really don't look like they're the same. So why don't you pick one of them to be GEO and pick one of them to be a different prefix within the context of the bioregistry? And at that point, you have to kind of maintain that clash. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think I'd have to give a much longer discussion about that. Yeah, go ahead, James, and then I'll try and finish this up.
Okay, I thought you were done. If you'd like to finish, I'd be happy to wait a minute.
Good. Give me a couple minutes. I'm going to finish up. So I think everybody kind of gets the idea who's worked on GitHub before that it makes sense to make it so people can work on this as a team. And then in the end, also part of this policy is that people who are working on this, they should be part of the publications that come out of it, and also recognized in terms of like the README and on the website itself, whether that's like an institutional contribution or funding sources, that kind of thing. Let's see what else. So I went a lot slower than I thought I would. There's one other bit I want to really talk about is like the sustainability of this, not on the personnel side, but kind of on the programmatic side. So yeah, Ben pointed out, which I hadn't quite got to yet, that all the data and all the code are open source. They're under permissive licenses. The fact that it's in a Python package and everything's running with very simple commands is also helpful. So the way that this website itself is deployed is every night when an update is made to the bioregistry, it also makes a new push to the PyPI, the Python package index. And also at the same time, it makes a new build of a Docker image using Docker Hub. And it does all this using this open infrastructure. It does it automatically. And then we have our own server, which is hosted on Amazon Web Services, which then redeploys the data, the new Docker image. So every day you can see kind of this version number bumps if there's been any changes to the database. It doesn't necessarily update every night because sometimes there aren't any improvements. So sometimes this doesn't update every day. And yeah, so it runs in a very, very small, the Docker image is only like on the scale of tens of megabytes. Its memory imprint is also less than 100 megabytes. Like it runs on an incredibly tiny system. The website itself, it's pretty cheap. We're paying like around $33 per year for it. This is right now being supported by like our group, the Indra Lab, within the Laboratory of Systems for Pharmacology at Harvard. But you know, this is like a pretty small cost that anybody could pick up in their slush fund, I think. Yeah, so it's running on this AWS system, and it's, you know, it's doing this all kind of locally. And so here's like the deployment script that basically is run every night on a cron job that kind of turns off the old version. It downloads the newest version, and then it like redeploys it. And then you can also actually automate this on a cron job externally using this like SSH command into the Amazon Web Service. So like if there's ever a case where somebody else needs to deploy this, hopefully they can do it basically the same way we did. You know, unlike identifiers.org and I guess the Perl system, like I don't think we should be having people rely on bioregistry like URIs for entities. So if the website name ever changes, like that's fine. And then, yeah, so some of the other questions that people were asking about, like, will the service still be running in 10 years? Well, assuming that we can keep the costs down, we basically can have this thing deployed the way it is. If GitHub doesn't change its infrastructure, if Docker Hub doesn't change its infrastructure, if Amazon Web Services stays pretty similar to how it is now. And yeah, and some of these other questions, I think we kind of answered with the idea of the governance. So the only thing I didn't show so far, which I will try and do very, very quickly, is the Python programmatic interface for this. So I'm going to stop this screen share. I'm going to start a new one. So here we are. Let's do it. Live coding demo. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new virtual environment. I'm going to pip install Bioregistry. And let's see how fast we can do some interesting stuff. So let's open up the Python interpreter. I'm just going to show you some of the top level functionality in the Bioregistry's Python package. And I'm going to do something very evil. I'm going to start import everything. So, okay, one of the things that I really wanted to be able to do at the beginning was normalize prefixes. So let's say like I'm normalizing the PDB. No surprise, PDB is already pretty normal. Let's say I want to normalize Kebi. So keeping in mind, like the Bioregistry has these canonical, like lowercase, unpunctuation, stripped versions of things. So it's going to normalize Kebi. It also is going to deal with like these mixed cased ones. It's going to normalize those properly. It's going to handle synonyms. So it turns out some people use taxonomy instead of NCBI taxon. It knows how to normalize that. It knows how to deal with some kind of funny punctuation like EC code. It knows to kind of get rid of that. EC dash code it can also handle. It also knows like some things that are common mistakes that people make. Like a lot of people say pubchem, and pubchem isn't really a good prefix. Usually people are talking about pubchem compounds when they say pubchem. So you get pubchem compound out. And then if you put in something totally garbage, it's not going to return anything. So, you know, you can use this and you can check if you're able to normalize stuff. Let's see, what else can we do? We can parse like CURIEs. Let's parse like Kibi 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so now we've got a tuple of Kibi 1, 2, 3, 4. That's pretty good. Let's parse like, let's parse a Go. So this is like Go, but it's got the lowercase instead. That seems to work. Sometimes people end up with this banana problem. And so it was really important that you could deal with this. So you can like deal with this go-go thing. It still figures it out. What else can we do? So not just can you parse a query, but you can also kind of normalize.
Charlie,
Yeah.
Sure, one moment. So can you just repeat one moment what this normalized prefix exactly is and why it's not using the preferred prefix in this case?
Yeah, so let's go back to the website really quick. So we were talking about Kibi. So the difference between the preferred prefix and the normalized prefix. So yeah, we can annotate these preferred prefixes. Right now, the only people who annotated those are the Obo Foundry. So anything from Obo Foundry is usually capitalized, except for a couple cases like FBBT and NCBI taxon also has this capitalization. But inside the database, the key that it stores everything to is this like normalized unpunctuated version. And in terms of doing the alignment for all of the different resources, this is the most practical. Now, the idea of the bioregistry is you can take all sorts of different kinds of stuff, and it uses the massive database and all the synonyms to sort of figure out what you have, put it into its own internal canonical form. And then at the end, you can map it back and you say, hey, I want the Obo flavor of this prefix. I want the, you know, there's another context. Yeah, I want the bioportal version of this. And so that might make it look a little bit different. Maybe, so you can you have to pick something to be the standard. And it's totally amenable that we can change what the internal standard of the bioregistry is, because it's like that XKCD problem. Like you have 14 standards. So let's make one overarching standard. And now you have 15 standards. So the idea is that we should be like putting stuff in and then taking it back out the way you want to use it. So let's talk about, so we can parse a query. Let's talk about normalizing a query. It's kind of the same thing. It just parses it and then it puts it back together using the delimiter. But I think the more interesting thing is like, once you've got one of these canonical bioregistry queries, like you want to do something with it. So maybe we want to get an IRI. So we do this with go 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so here's the first thing is like, if you've got one of these, you can generate the go link, but sometimes you want to generate Obo Foundry links. So you should be able to give like a priority and say,
Charlie, I
Yep.
think we should
getting
stick
too
a
much
few
into
more
this.
minutes because there's a lot of chat now about this issue with the normalization and preferred. So I think we need to stick with this and at least explain and resolve this conversation a bit.
all right. So maybe it's a good place to stop here. So I guess the last thing I'll say is all of the different functionalities you can get programmatically, maybe the most useful ones, they're all written kind of in the bioregistry's README. So I would allow everybody to kind of take a look at that. I'm actually going to make a little video going through all of these cases I was just talking about. So I'm going to stop the screen share there, and maybe we'll have a little bit of discussion, and then we can get to the breakout session, which will top us up. And we've got about 50 minutes left. So yeah, James, go ahead.
Thanks. I think I'm addressing the topic that Nico was worried about. So yeah, I mean, sorry for the shit sandwich. I really admire how the way you've set up the code and thought about governance and all sorts of different things about this. I would be happy to go on at length about all the things that I think you did really well. But I am really worried about this this last little bit. And if, I don't know, maybe you wouldn't mind screen sharing again, I would take the example of OBI, which is Obo ontology that I'm responsible for. And I'm the technical lead on that project. So if you go to like Bioregistry and we look for OBI on the website,
screen share.
Yeah, so there's all this stuff. There's a prefix, preferred prefix, I don't know, pattern. You scroll down, you see all the other registries and all the other like URLs where we can find stuff. Bioregistry makes it look like these are all the same, but the OBI project is committed to Obo and the Obo principles and how things are named. So only that perl.obolibrary.org is the correct identifier for our terms. And we really strongly recommend that you use like uppercase OBI when you're doing prefix maps and queries. We have a very specific way that we want you to expand it. You don't have to do that. We can't force anybody to do that, but that's the way we want it to be done. And if you go to any of the ontology browsers that load OBI in, like Bioportal or OLS or OntoB, they will all give you our PERLs, our proper identifiers, as the identifiers to use for our projects. But Bioregistry isn't doing that. It makes it look like all these things are just the same, just as good. And it feels to me like it's the same thing that identifiers.org did. Like I wasn't involved with identifiers.org, although some other OBO people were. Maybe I'm misrepresenting this, but if they just slurp up all our OBO identifiers and then they give them new URLs, and then they promise they're going to stick around and then they don't, then that makes everything harder for everybody, including like my users of OBI, and that's something I care about a lot. And then specifically, I think your normalize query or whatever function for OBI is not going to give me the uppercase OB, which is the prefix that I want.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, the URI one is not going to give me the Perl for OB, whatever term, which is what I want. Then, yeah, that bugs me. And I think that's what Chris was mentioning a second ago.
What does
the
the
chat.
URI give? Like, just out of curiosity, if I would use the URI get URI method, what would it give for OB?
It always shows whatever you'd use. The get IRI method is the first one, the one that goes with the prefix, like matches it. So like the canonical one that the Bioregistry gives back for OB is the Perl from OBO library.
Just, I don't know if people who watch this recording afterwards will see the chat, but we're seeing a chorus of approvals for for James's comments there.
Okay.
So sorry, I don't think I quite understood, Charlie. Would you mind just demonstrating in the terminal what happens for like this OB term?
Sure. So here we go. We've got get
Thank you.
IRI, and we've got OB, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you get your Perl. Now, it's not really pedantic about how you write it. I know you're expecting it to be a certain way, but you can also do this lowercase, and it normalizes it to. And the idea of having this lowercase version is that you have to pick some way of normalizing all the strings, because whether you're knowledgeable about OB's desires for everyone to use the capital OBI, somebody might use OBI with lowercase somewhere. We don't want the Bioregistry to explode and not work. We want to be able to handle both of those. In fact, I'm going to do something that'll make everyone very upset. Here's OBI, completely wrong, weird case sensitive change. That should still work too.
I mean, there is another option, which is you fail and you say that's wrong. So that's not the options you want, but it's another option.
Isn't it?
That is an option.
Isn't it the case that for some of these functionalities you want to be permissive, because the goal here is to get an IRI, not to validate what you put in, and there can be separate validation-oriented functions that do fail when something isn't standardized, right? So I think that there's maybe an advantage to being permissive for some of these endpoints and have, you know, the appropriate validation and standardization checks in place if the goal is to make sure that what you have is valid.
So let's find a very quick function.
You recognize the downside though, right? The downside is people rely on the system. They think, oh, OB underscore is always going to work. They start using OB underscore in their data, and then it doesn't work because that's not the preferred prefix that OBO uses in its standard context, and other people just aren't doing it that way. Like as long as just you recognize that problem, right? Once you start accepting bad input, then you have to live with it forever.
I recognize that. However, bad input is relative to your context. And one of the core ideas of the Bioregistry is not to be super pedantic about the context. So for example, we have this get OBO foundry prefix function. And if you type in OB, it's going to give you OBI capitalized back, because that's how it should look if you're in OBO foundry context. And so I implemented this function. Is this a valid OBO prefix? So let's run that. OBI. Valid OBO. Okay, so that's true. And if we have OBI in lowercase, it's false. So the Bioregistry is a tool that can allow you to build systems that validate if people are doing things the right way in your context. And it has some tools for making sure that you can kind of generate IRIs with certain contexts, because some of that stuff's already built in.
Just one more time, and with respect and love. The worry is that you're encouraging bad behavior, right? And that's the worry. And you've tried to address it in a million different ways, but it's still the worry.
If I'm enabling bad behavior, yes, because in the end, this is a practical tool. I want to be able to use data that's been created by people who are doing things wrong And I would love to help everybody do things right. But in fact, it's very difficult to change things that are wrong because people even rely on things to be wrong in certain places already. So we can't make the world perfect. I know there are perfect tools that could be used to make the world perfect, but it's a difficult.
I think there is a way to do both here. I think some of these things here, I think we're just by maybe changing things like normalize, changing the behavior of kind of normalized prefix so that it gives you the provider preferred one, for example. I think you can still have methods that are liberal in what they accept, and you can have parameters that tell you, is this strict or not? Maybe we could turn on kind of like strict by default, but allow people, but I think what I'm seeing here is just a lot of defaults that cause my skin to crawl in some ways, like seeing a Go ID normalized as something with like lowercase go, seeing the IRI for obo ontologies like Uberon not return the kind of like the obo pearls. Maybe this is just something we need to kind of go on. I don't know if this is just something we need to go and curate in Bioregistry, or how much is actually baked into the system here.
We can, well, there's a lot of different things that we can do to curate and change what the defaults for things are. There's hooks for changing a lot of these defaults. One thing is,
I think it could be a good compromise to make some of these functions be strict by default, but have either versions of them or parameterized versions of them that, or have parameters for them that allow you to run them in a non-strict mode, right? And then both of these are catered to. And I would be okay with having them strict by default.
Yeah, sure. The good news is it's all like really easy to update this code to do kind of whatever we want it to. We're not in this like closed system where there is no code and we can only do what's available in some undocumented API endpoint. I mean, in the end, the resolver is built on this get IRI function. So yeah, I mean, feedback is super appreciated. Like we can change anything to make it fit the needs of the community.
I do think that generally we have to think that if we manage to get people to use such an API and use a standard resolver and for IRIs to find the correct URI prefixes for a query and the other way around, I think this should result in a standard practice, and people should learn from that. If this API returns Go with lowercase colon the number, they will start using this, and this is not how Go would ever do it themselves. So if they see that it would always return the preferred one, they will learn it also cognitively, and they will also represent it in the correct way over time. So it's also a bit of teaching the community to use the right prefixes and not use so the ones that the provider actually uses and suggests. And I think that given we have open system here where we can curate like what the provider believes are the correct prefixes and URI prefixes here, the default ones, this is an opportunity to implement that. And yeah, I definitely 100% think we should use preferred prefixes and preferred URI.
Nico just cut out, so I don't know if he's done or. Okay, so what else is going on in the chat? I do evil things with my prefixes, like having ILX and ILX mean different things. Oh, that's really sad. I'm sorry.
But
one question is,
doesn't matter in your tools, like whatever your RDF tools are case sensitive. They handle all that stuff. If it's just private in your local database, then it all works. It all just works. Anyway.
So okay, I think everyone's got a lot of stuff to sort of digest from the bioregistry. Let's see, we should teach the world to use correct URI prefixes. Yeah, I think the problem with a lot of this discussion is like what's correct is really different to different people. And I think it's still hard to prescribe what's correct.
For the obo stuff.
Right. But not in the
teams
cases
have
where the
committed to it.
provider have said, this is my prefix, this is my URI. Granted, not everyone does those, but in the cases where people do that, you know, we can support that.
I think that's a fair compromise, sure. So what do you think? That means we need to get providers to make those decisions. So for example, like a lot of the Obo Foundry stuff, I can import the preferred prefixes from Obo Foundry. And in fact, we recently made all of the preferred prefixes for non-deprecated resources explicit, since they were only explicit for the ones that had strange mixed case, like NCBI taxon and Vario and FPPT. But now it's explicit for all of them. So now we know for which how it's supposed to look. So when that's the case, I guess that means that we should use those. For everybody else, it's sort of up to, you know, how you want to use it. Okay.
So I don't know. I mean, this all looks really nice, and it reminds me a bit of W3ID approach, right? Which is also using GitHub, but it's sort of more elaborate. And I guess my thought here is the social side of this is really important, and you've started dealing with that by having this meeting. The social and the funding side, because even though it's just a small amount of money, right? And the political side too, because you've got other people that are trying to maintain different things, right? And I guess I would kind of think that it would be important to talk some big funder like NIH to have a long-running project that would fund maintainers on this and pay for the servers. And sure, you can do this as a side project. I just think a little more established social infrastructure might help adoption. Would solve the problems of, well, how are you, you know, you don't have enough time, you went over to the server went down because you stopped funding it, or anything like that.
And I think having somebody else host it and run it, I think that's totally fine. But I think what we wouldn't want to move away from is this distributed model of contributions and issues and reviews on GitHub, right? So it wouldn't be a good outcome to have this be moved to NIH, where there's maybe like temporary funding for a team that will go away in 5 years, and then we're in the same situation again. I don't think that, right?
I guess what I would think is maybe that somehow this great idea and this distributed approach have multiple sets of overlapping funding at a low level from, I don't know, the EU, NIH, whatever. Just talk to the right people, and maybe you can get some funding lines set up, or foundations or whatever. It's small amount, but just so that you don't have lapses. And it could be hosted by, you know, I mean, it's on Amazon, you're distributing everything. I'm really concerned about the funding and having some way of making sure that nothing lapses.
I think James should maybe make the point he was putting in the chat right now, if you don't mind echoing that.
Sorry. I mean, yeah, I don't want to rain on anybody's parade, but yeah, for the 12 plus years that I've been involved in OBO, we've always talked about long-term funding. We've never been able to get any of it. I've been to multiple meetings where NIH or some branch of NIH talks about long-term funding for like whatever, ontologies, infrastructure. I've seen, sometimes I see final reports talking about how critical it is, and years go by and it hasn't happened. So I'm, I guess, a little bit disappointed in that. And that's one of the things that I would praise the Bioregistry team for, like just thinking that through and doing it as well as I think we can do at this point in time. You know, keeping costs low, keeping the organization distributed and open. I think that's really the right way to do things. That's the best way we've got on our shoestring budgets that we actually have.
Me, speaking from within NIH, I mean, I don't want to get into you know, all of the details that lie behind the well-known problems that, you know, that James is describing. But I think what would be helpful from this community is to identify that there's a need for a piece of core infrastructure here, and don't make it a funding question. I mean, NIH can look at it and say, well, is this, see, I'm confused, and I've been exchanging email with a colleague here about it, is why isn't NCBI in this conversation? What part of this might NCBI pick up? But it's something that, I mean, this is such, you could extrapolate this to other pieces of infrastructure that we need, but this is such a core thing that it's a good case for saying, like, how should this be provided to the biomedical community? And an organization like NIH, which funds, you know, is the largest funder of that community, needs to think about that somehow. And hopefully we can get past this situation that yeah, sure, long-term funding for OBO, there are many projects like that where that comes up. But, you know, it seems if we focused on this one, we could maybe get some kind of pattern where how that applies in other cases could begin to emerge. I mean, I'm glad that INSDC was mentioned because, you know, aside from the problems with it, the thing is that's a international agreement between three of the, you know, the major players, and yeah, addressing it at that kind of level, you know, seems that there's some mileage in that.
Ian, if this group wanted, you know, maybe this group doesn't want to go this route, but I'm just going to ask if this group wanted to put together some kind of a document like, you know, these RFIs go out, but in the absence of an RFI, just a letter to NIH, is there a particular form or individual it should be sent to or whatever?
Well, the best place right now would be the Office of Data Science Strategy, ODSS, Susan Gregorick's office. But there are various forums where, you know, we could perhaps, you know, and different people have done this at times. John has come and talked, but yeah, I would say possibly there are various forums where if we could get a presentation of the issues too, that I think that would begin to raise it at an NIH level.
So here's a question: assuming we had money, let's say we were successful, we got money. Who would want to be part of this? Who would want to make contributions, if anybody? Yeah.
That's my point. Is don't make it that kind of question.
Oh,
don't make it how.
Good.
Do not make this how do we get money question. It's a question. Put it forward as how do we get what what is it that the community needs to solve this problem?
Of course, then you get into, well, somebody else at NIH has a better idea of how to do that, but still, you could reverse engineer the use case for this effort out of what you did, and then state it as a use case, and then say, and by the way, we built this, you know.
And I just wanted to say that I think that in my mind, the goal is not to institutionalize this and find funding, long-term funding, but rather to find ways to not be reliant on precisely those things, to try to work out as much of this as possible in a way that it doesn't require long-term funding, and it's immediately possible for anybody to run this on their own infrastructure, take over, not have to worry about licenses on the data or anything like that, right? Relying on stable public and free infrastructure like GitHub, GitHub Actions, Docker Hub. So that's sort of, I think, what most of the conversation should be about. And then, yes, there will be a remaining $30 for reserving the domain per year. although there's no reason why a domain has to exist. I mean, like you can run this without a domain, I suppose. But make that as minimal as possible and not make it a requirement. So for instance, if somebody else wants to run this, they don't necessarily have to use the bioregistry.io domain, right? The whole system doesn't really rely on that domain being anything specific. So I think that's the most, and I think that this could be a very interesting model for other biomedical resources, because I think if there's anything that we've learned over the years is that, people leave their jobs, funding ends, research teams are moved or shut down, or right, and they're just like, I think this could be an interesting way to try to get around these issues.
I have a hard time. I mean, I agree that all the software goals, very portable, very instantly possible to reproduce this on a new host. All those goals are great, but if you have a set of URLs whose links change every 4 or 5 years because a new host had to be found and someone had to do a bunch of scrambling, that doesn't seem like a good basis for a lot of basic science.
But John, the point of the bioregistry isn't to be a new system for minting new URLs. I think that it's the infrastructure to allow you to access these other systems, which are spending their time being more persistent, like the Obo Perl.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. I was incorporating I think my hat is the N2T. So the meta resolver is the thing that needs to be up 24/7 and stable, and it's going to use data from, say, the bioregistry. But so I think, the bioregistry can feed these other systems, but I think those other systems need to be stable.
James?
Yeah, just to throw one other thing in, respectfully and with love and affection. I think I keep hearing you have to explain the bioregistry is not for minting new URLs, which I think is true, and you're agreeing with that. I think it's a situation where if you have to explain it, then you're already in trouble. So
that's a good point.
Yeah, I guess I think it's an important point that the prefixes and identifiers are the important part, and not like the resolution URL here, like bioregistry.io/whatever, right? Because the former is not dependent on where the system is running, and the latter is. And I think we need to make that point clear.
I would be happy to do an N2T, 3 minutes, just to quickly show people how incredibly simple the system is and how easy it is to adapt and modify. I think it's possibly instructive, just to as the meta resolver that Ian, I think, correctly identified as it's a pointer to a bunch of different individual prefix resolvers. And Charlie, I wasn't quite sure I agreed with your characterization of that, but that's how I see it, and it might be interesting to see that, make that offer if there's interest.
Yeah, please show us. Can you screen share, or do I need to enable that?
I'll try to screen share and see what happens. Yeah, so I'm literally in a file called prefixes.yaml. It's a YAML file. So this is a file that's compiled from separate sources. One source is identifiers.org, and this is an example of the KEBI record. It's been reformatted. There is no other database. So in the sense that at N2T, this is exactly what's running. If I were to go in here and edit one of these fields and then reload the system this would instantly take effect. So there's nothing else. The YAML file is loaded and redirection happens from there. Another source is the ARC registry. Also, just some extra things that are not part of identifiers.org. So the ARC registry is a set of endpoints for the ARC identifiers and gives the patterns. So here, for example, is the redirection pattern for this. You put the ID at the end, but the ID could actually be substituted anywhere. Anyway, at the end, there's a old snapshot of the prefix commons. So, if we get a YRC prefix, we'll redirect it here. But the way it works is if there's a conflict, a clash, the first prefix that's listed in this YAML file wins. So that's what, so it's very simple to include. There's no other policy baked in here. And for a reason, it's, because I don't know policy. So the policy can be set in the, in the data basically. So if we needed to add a preferred prefix, we could just edit here, right? Preferred, and then the code would have to be adapted to, to respond to that. But this is how easy it is. This is unlike identifiers.org, which has a large database behind it. And this is basically just a YAML file. So, and I'll just do one quick, one final, I think, here. So if you go to N2T and you type in like Kebi : you get all the Kebi related records. So these are, you could just inspect the records this way, or if you enter an actual, 36927, you'll be sent off to that. You'll be redirected there. You can also inspect, your various ARC prefixes, and you'll get the prefixes and shoulders that are available here. So anyway, it's easy to inspect, and I think that's probably enough for now. But my approach to sustainability is like, keep it simple. That's all there is to it.
John, is that registry, like the YAML file, is it version controlled on like GitHub where somebody can make a suggestion?
No, and the reason is that this is completely downstream from several sources. So one source might be, one source for this file would be some GitHub maintained repo where people can submit issues and pull requests and so forth. So that's not what N2T is for. N2T is to sort of harvest these sources. So it doesn't have that, you don't directly manipulate it.
Okay.
So John, I think we maybe talked about this before, we referenced it before. In a redundant system with N2T as it exists now, how would it work for there to exist multiple copies of what you're describing at multiple locations and keep them synchronized? I know this came up when we were talking about the GA4GH DIRS service, because one use case came up was that for performance reasons, people needed to keep their own local meta resolvers. And we talked then a little bit about how the infrastructure might apply, but that was a while ago, and I'm rusty on how well it would work.
There's nothing, N2T doesn't have anything exotic to say about that subject other than the standard practices of, you could have N2T DNS record point to 4 different locations in the world, which all have a synchronized YAML file running at them. Whatever one is picked at random, or possibly through DNS manipulations or geographically closer. So you have redundancy that way, and if one goes down. So that's an old and standard practice. There are probably smarter things to do, but basically one synchronized YAML file, multiple instances of N2T running.
And if those YAML files were edited remotely, so you can synchronize both ways.
Oh, there's no, nothing that fancy is
Okay.
is currently supported or envisioned. But that's keeping it simple. So it's no multi-master kind
Right.
of maintenance right now. It's harvested nightly, so I mean the prefixes you probably don't have to. They're not that dynamic. It seems like that would be sufficient, but whatever source they come from, they could all be updated simultaneously.
I just want to, I might have to leave it soon, but I just wanted to chime in and say I agree about the scoping. It would be good to get something that is scope neutral in the name. And also the fact that the upstream identifiers.org source of truth is something that only like one or two people, if that, have the power to actually action, does make it hard to be responsive. So there are funding constraints, there are time constraints, and if the only thing that someone can do to improve the situation for something that is either pending or out of date, if the only thing that can be done is complain, it adds a lot of overhead to that process. And so I really like the idea of just having something that can be done in a drive-by way where the curation can be more distributed and more redundant. So I think from the identifiers.org perspective, they've got a lot of legacy stuff they need to maintain, and there's the whole vertical stack is very long in the tooth. And if they were able to, for instance, adopt the Bioregistry stack and just populate it with everything they've already got, but just then use that machinery, then they would be able to better assess discrepancies where they exist, and have this distributed curation at their fingertips. I think Charlie's already done the hard work of setting this up, and no one wants identifiers.org to stop existing, but the fact that it has become hard to fix is the issue.
So I think we've got like about 15 minutes left. Maybe it's time to start summarizing some of the big points and think about what do we do moving forwards, since the conversation's really gone a wide variety about the content, about community building, about funding, about technology stacks, and then also about philosophy. So, so I guess we have to start thinking, what do we do moving forwards? I think that, I want to echo again what Ben said, is that we don't want to necessarily have the bioregistry be something that's waiting for funding that may never come. We really do want to push this idea that anybody who's interested can contribute, and that those contributions anybody can take and incorporate into their systems, whether it's named a thing, if identifiers.org wants to take those curations and suck them back up. So this isn't stuff that just is when you contribute to someone else's database, they benefit, but you don't. This isn't that kind of situation. So I guess one of the things I really wanted to end is to give a call to action. Does anybody want to get more involved? Whether it's just talking about the issues that you have and putting them onto the GitHub, making it possible for technical solution, or if anybody wants to donate like an hour of their time to write some code. Daniel's got his hand up, so maybe go ahead and interject.
Yeah, hey, happy to contribute. I love the model. I just wanted to say generally how excited I am about this project. It seems like you've solved these pretty hard problems. You've integrated things nicely, and it seems like it's already the best solution if people have a lot of CURIEs and want to clean them up. And, you know, as a data scientist, I'm sucking up CURIEs or identifiers every day, and they're almost always dirty. And I think we probably all have made dirty identifiers at some point in the past. So, you know I work with a lot of OBO ontologies, and they're full of very dirty identifiers, and they're XREFs. And so I see one action we could take is just, if you're a data maintainer, running all of your identifiers through this and normalizing them using, you know, the preferred capitalization if you'd like, and then saving the purified version. So that would, I think, help users a lot. I'm going to start doing that with some of my own stuff. And then a question I had, if you know, we really want this to move beyond the Python community, it seems like libraries for other languages would be helpful, like R, you know, maybe like Spark, that kind of stuff. Any plans on that front?
I'm a Python programmer in my heart, but you know, I wouldn't be against trying to do it with one of the other languages. I think R would definitely be the next step for the data science and the biology community.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I mean, and again, I think that this model allows people to contribute and make this part of the central package. So it's not necessarily relying on Charlie and I having the bandwidth to do this. But I think it would be a good idea to extend to other languages.
And yeah, I think it's great that the core part is in Python, but that's not what has to be replicated, just the functions to normalize the identifiers and, I guess, download the database.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess we might as well wrap up then, because we had all these really nice discussions. It's been recorded. I'll do my best to try and write some of this stuff down in this Google Doc that we've talked about. I will move some of the stuff out of the Google Doc into this website, which kind of goes with the biopragmatic stack GitHub organization, which is kind of where the Bioregistry's repository lives. I know we didn't get to some of the actual breakout discussions about some of the more nitty-gritty stuff. So if you guys are interested in that, you can always check up on the issue tracker and try and find some of those. And we're still trying to make those discussions, you know, work for a wide group of people. So I think this was an interesting way to start or restart a very long discussion. And yeah, so I hope that everybody feels comfortable to kind of reach out either publicly on GitHub or privately if you'd like. I hope everyone has my contact information. I somehow got a hold of you, so it means you have my email address. So I think we can kind of leave it at that. One of the things that will come up soon is to write sort of a paper on the Bioregistry and some of the problems that it solves, and you know, people's different opinions on how that might work to solve their problems versus how it might conflict with some of the ways they do things. I think that's all really valuable to include in the paper. So I wish I'd mentioned this a little bit earlier when the group was a little bigger, but I'd like to, you know, extend to anybody the opportunity to join in authoring that paper. Maybe in a way such that it includes a little bit more philosophy in addition to the fact that it's a tool that solves a problem and has some scientific value. Yeah, and so I think that's a good place to leave it. There's like one more question that John asked in the chat. Can you summarize the targeted level of rigor of this project given the conflicts inherent? Really like the work.
So as we're reading the notes, you can see that things are mentioned, but you don't really see answers, conclusions that someone can tell, okay, where are we trying to go? Do we know yet? How perfect a solution are we aiming for?
Yeah, I think we have kind of a moving target when it comes to this, because as it's built, it solves a lot of problems really well in a really simple way, but it doesn't have the high-mindedness and the correctness like that. It depends on your perspective. So I think maybe like this idea of having the lowercase prefixes, this really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And you know, so I started doing this and I said, this is very practical, so I'm going to do it this way. But, you know, things are different when you build a project for yourself versus when you think other people might adopt them. The good news is like, it's possible to fix that kind of stuff. It doesn't mean that it can't be done. So the question is to figure out like who has these things that they need. And hopefully it's not the case that people have opposite conflicting things that they both need at the same time. And then we can try and address those. hold on, I'll ask Nico. Nico asked, how many conflicts are there currently? What do you mean by conflicts exactly?
Like, is there any ambiguities, like with the geo example? How many ambiguities are there if I were to try to resolve the query?
There's 4.
Awesome. Interesting.
I will make a website that will automatically be the list of conflicts so anybody can investigate it. It's not a big problem as much as people would think it is.
It's not a big problem currently if you are dealing with a certain set of resources, right? But if you add all the people who are using prefixes and all of the people who will be using prefixes in the future, unless those are all managed as part of this, that's the open question, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So like one thing is that the Obo Foundry can consider like, all right, let's use this as a list of prefixes that people can't mint. Maybe other groups can also just look at this list of prefixes and say, don't pick anything that's like those capitalization variants or not, punctuation variants or not.
Right. And please look at BioPortal's prefixes too, and don't conflict with those. And please, good. Okay. We're on the same page, I think. It is hard. Thanks.
You want to go?
Yeah, so I think one other way to think about this is that, as you say, conflicts only occur within a context, or within a what do we call it, an identifier space where you have multiple, where you have a user that needs a conflicting set, and that is a point at which you could resolve the conflicts. So Wikipedia has these disambiguation pages where they say, did you mean A or B? And that's another way that one could try to address these kinds of issues, which is to say, we're in the business of trying to get you to an answer. And if you can tell us that you're coming from a life sciences background, then we'll make geo resolve correctly. If you're coming from a geology perspective, we can make that resolve correctly. There's of course issues with that if you want your URIs to have context independent meaning. But also if people are going to, for example, they say, hey, I need a prefix, I need a JSON LD prefix context, and I need it for these 20 ontologies. Most of the time, as you said, we're not going to run into these issues at all, and we'll be able to use the preferred upstream prefixes for all of those individual ontologies. That's another way that I think we might think about trying to resolve some of those conflicts.
All right. So we've got a lot of stuff to keep discussing. So like I mentioned, join us on the Obo Foundry Slack. We have a channel called #prefixes. This is an open Slack that anybody's welcome to join, and you don't have to subscribe to any channels you don't want to. Get in touch on GitHub, or feel free to get in touch privately. Thank you everybody for joining. I know we have a lot of things that we have to follow up on, so I'm looking forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Yeah,
Organizing.
that's great. Yeah, great work.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a nice Halloween weekend, and nice afternoon.
Happy Halloween.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.